Welcome back to our module on evaluation and sustainability. As we think about how we talk about evaluation in our grant applications, in this section we'll be talking about qualitative evaluation. In the last section we talked about quantitative, so it was all about collecting information, collecting data that we could analyze. So what then would be qualitative evaluation? This is where we're thinking about people, asking questions of people, getting input from people. There's going to be a lot of conversation in this type of evaluation because qualitative data, it is about collecting people's story, collecting people's individual feedback. What was it like to be a part of this project or program? What did you like? What didn't you like? What might you want to see in the future? These aren't things, this isn't input that can simply be counted. In fact, just recently, I got a phone call myself. One of my daughters had been part of a program that was being evaluated per the requirements of their grant maker, and we had filled out a survey that gave the numerical, how happy were you, how satisfied, type questions. We had already answered those on a 1 to 5 scale, but they were also conducting phone interviews to ask for individual stories, to ask for individual feedback. What was it like to use that at-home after-school kit? What would have made it better? How involved were you? What was your favorite activity and why? Getting at that why, getting at the unique feedback that I as a parent would provide. My experience was likely very different than another parent based on work and the house setting, etc. at that very moment. And so they wanted to collect as much individualized feedback from individual parents and caregivers as they could. So they were conducting phone stories. Not only did that phone call take about 15 minutes of my time and the staff person's time, but now she's got all sorts of information to document. So this is a very different type of evaluation than how they had originally conducted the quantitative evaluation, the online survey that gave numeric responses that could quickly be averaged or analyzed. I say quickly, but it's relative to the amount of time it's going to take to analyze this qualitative data that's about the stories and the individual feedback. So here is a list of some of the types of data collection that you might see in your organization now, or you might experience in other nonprofit programs. So the phone interview example I just gave, great, that's an individual interview. But maybe your organization conducts focus groups. Now, some organizations will use focus groups as a way to assess need. That's more like the process to think about what are we going to design and offer in the future. Well, the focus group can have two purposes. It could help you to evaluate a current project or program and also to assess the need for what you do in the future. So it can help us both in wrapping up a project or program and also planning for the next. But so focus groups are an example of a group interview. Observation could be one of the data collection methods we use. So a staff person or an evaluator watching a situation unfold and taking notes and assessing based on what they observe. We could have a larger community meeting for input. Depending on the scale of the project or program, that might be appropriate to bring together a whole group of community stakeholders to get feedback. Depending on the types of conversations that are being had, the interactions in a project or program, maybe there's even transcripts or recordings that are available that can be listened to and analyzed after the fact. All of these data collection methods, the thing that they have in common are that they are going to take time to analyze. It's about those stories, it's about collecting that individual feedback, even if in a group setting is how it's gathered. And so it takes time to figure out what are the commonalities, what are some of the themes, what are the big lessons versus something that might be an individual outlier in terms of the data that's been collected, the individual responses that were received. So as we come together as a team trying to decide what type of evaluation will we be utilizing in a project or program that we plan to apply for a grant for, we should look back to the same 5 questions for discussion that we did when we talked about quantitative evaluation. I'm not going to read and review these questions again. You've already seen them when we talked about quantitative evaluation. The team should use these same guiding prompts. That grant team that comes together, that group of individuals that has a stake in grants being successful, should come together and discuss these questions again to say, well, for the focus group, what's the purpose for this evaluation? For those individual phone interviews to the parents, what is the purpose? How are we going to use those findings? How's it going to make things better for our project and program? How will we utilize that information? That will help us decide what are we going to commit to that we will then write about in the grant application. Those same questions that we looked at in the example from the grant maker. Who's going to measure the outcome? Who's going to actually, let's go back to my phone interview example. Who's going to measure? So who's going to make the phone calls? And who's going to analyze the results of those conversations? That might not be the same person. What tool is going to be measured? So what are the survey questions that would be used in that individual phone interview? When is it measured? So within the project timeline, when are those phone calls going to be made? And why have we decided to measure this in this way? These questions, again, will be helpful for us to get answered so that we can draft out a grant application narrative that ties to our outcomes in our logic model, that we have the individual key activities for represented in our work plan, and helps to connect all the dots for our grant maker. Just like with quantitative evaluation, we need to understand when and where within the process will we be gathering this input. Now, if this is the sort of evaluation that takes more time for us to analyze, and sometimes even more time for us to gather, will we be able to watch it during the period of performance, during the grant award period, and to know if there's something amiss that we need to make corrective action for, or if there's something that everyone loves? It's one of the best things about the project or program, but we weren't planning to continue that. Oh, maybe we should. Could we make that snap decision, make a quick choice within the grant award period? Do we have the resources to do so? I don't know. But are we able to watch that qualitative data, what we're gathering, what we're learning as a result of analyzing those stories, that feedback? Are we able to learn anything while the grant is still being implemented? That's a huge question mark. In some cases, the answer is definitely not, but it's worth considering, because if you have the capacity to learn from qualitative evaluation while the grant is ongoing, you might be able to make changes in a good way, or to change something that was not going as expected. You would want to tell the grant maker about that. You would want to let them know what your plan was for how you'll use that evaluation, that data, and maybe make some changes if needed, or if for the betterment of the program. You don't want to commit to it if you don't have the resources or the capacity. It certainly will take even more time in the qualitative evaluation space if you're going to do that, but it's worth having the conversation as a team, seeing if you have the capacity, seeing if it should be part of your key activities, and including it as needed. So here's the big question then. What should you use? What do grant makers want to see? What do they expect to see? Should it be quantitative or qualitative or both? What is appropriate? What is expected? What will make you competitive? This is a huge "it depends" answer, and here's why. Evaluation can be lightweight. It can be some data collection that is able to be analyzed by existing staff without a lot of extra training or without a brand new database. And yes, it takes time to analyze, but perhaps it's something that doesn't take a great deal of a project budget. Could happen. On the other hand, evaluation can take a significant portion of a grant budget, 10, 15, 20% of a grant budget, depending on the expectations and the rigor with which the evaluation, the assessment of the work, the analysis related to impact for the project or program, depending on that expectation, there might be a significant portion of the budget that would be required to go towards evaluation. So it depends not only on what you want to have happen as an organization, but also what are the desires of the grant maker? What level of evaluation do they deem to be appropriate? And based on what the funder deems to be appropriate, what sort of budgetary resources are they willing to contribute to evaluation? When you're reading guidelines related to evaluation, one of the things to watch for are floors, so a minimum amount or a minimum percent that you need to spend on evaluation. That gives you an indicator for the minimum of what the grant maker is going to expect. Or ceilings, a maximum amount or percent that you are able to spend on evaluation out of the funded project or program budget. Those give you indicators for what is the rigor of the evaluation that you should be designing and implementing as part of your project or program. Now, that's not always the case. There are not always floors and ceilings related to evaluation costs included in grant guidelines. It's great when they do, but it's not always there. So what do we do with foundations that don't include that sort of detail, or in government grants that might not provide that level of structure related to evaluation? We might ask. It's a great question to ask if we're reaching out to grant makers to get some clarification, to get some additional input about what level, what type, what detail are they looking for related to evaluation. If we're thinking about our evaluation, we also want to consider the time period. So let's look back to our logic model. When we think about our short-term outcomes, our intermediate outcomes, and our long-term outcomes, how long is the grant award period? And therefore, what time period might the budget cover? Are we talking only about short-term outcomes? Well, therefore, we're talking about qualitative and quantitative tools and measurement evaluation for only our short-term outcomes. Does the award period cover intermediate outcomes? Well, then we should be talking about the options for quantitative and qualitative for both short-term and intermediate outcomes. And of course, then at long-term, if it's a much longer grant award period, we need to again look at what might we propose for those 3 time periods of outcomes for both quantitative and qualitative. Depending on the length of the grant, we might say, sorry, unfortunately, what we're going to have the ability to do is this, unless there were more funding resources available. We can have that conversation with a grant maker if their guidelines are not clear, again, on that floor or ceiling related to evaluation. The reality is that the evaluation is designed to help the grant maker understand what level of accountability have you built into the project or program, and how are you going to learn as a result of the implementation, which is going to be the perfect segue into our 3rd section in this module. But before we go there, if you have any questions about qualitative evaluation, how you might assess your internal capacity related to it, how do you think about the time and expertise it takes to analyze this type of evaluation for your grant application, please be sure to reach out. You can reach me at Diane at dhleonardconsulting.com. And I look forward to seeing you in the next section of this module on evaluation.